You are listening to Russia on the Record, a podcast from the Moscow Times. Each week, we bring you the latest news and expert analysis on what's going on in Russia. And this week, we're going to explore a new report that shines light on the enormous scale of political repression in the country. But first, here's what's been going on over the past week. The funeral of Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny will be held on March the 1st in a church in southwestern Moscow. Reportedly, many other locations had refused to host the memorial, which will be open to the public. His widow, Yulia Navalnaya, told the European Parliament that she was unsure whether the funeral would be peaceful or if people who came to pay their respects would be arrested. His allies previously said that the Kremlin was refusing to return Navalny's body to his family unless they promised they would not hold a public funeral. And the lawyer who accompanied Navalny's mother to the morgue was also briefly detained this week. Navalny's allies have said that the opposition leader was being considered for release as part of a prisoner exchange in return for Vadim Khrushchev, a Russian national who was serving a life prison sentence in Germany for the 2019 murder of a former Chechen rebel in Berlin. Putin has repeatedly hinted, including in his recent interview with Tucker Carlson, that he would be open to exchanging Khrushchev for high-profile Westerners held in Russian prisons. The Financial Times reported that former US Marine Paul Whelan and American journalist Evan Gershkovich, who will soon have been in detention for over a year without ever having had a trial, were due to be released alongside Navalny. But an unnamed US official said that with Navalny dead, German officials had lost their enthusiasm for exchanging Khrushchev. The veteran human rights activist Oleg Orlov was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for discrediting the Russian army by speaking out against the war. The 70-year-old activist is co-chair of the Nobel Peace Prize-winning Memorial Organization, which was liquidated in 2021 for violating Russia's foreign agents laws. Orlov was one of a handful of Russian activists who chose to remain in Russia after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when many chose to leave. He told the Moscow Times he chose to stay because he did not want to run away from persecution, and he wanted to use his trial as an opportunity to speak freely. The State Duma has passed a bill that would ban advertisers from working with organizations branded foreign agents. Even though the bill is yet to be signed into law, it has already had a chilling effect. Russian journalist Katerina Gordeeva, who was designated a foreign journalist in 2022, has announced that she would shut down her popular YouTube interview series. Early voting in the presidential elections has kicked off in occupied Ukraine. Critics have warned that an extended period of early voting, which will continue until March the 14th, makes it easier for voter fraud to take place, as it becomes harder for monitors to notice irregularities. About 116,000 people in Russia have been subjected to direct political repression over the past 6 years, according to a recent study by Proekt media. According to their findings, the number of people convicted on political charges during Vladimir Putin's most recent presidential term alone exceeds the figures recorded in the USSR under Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev. This week, we decided to analyse the study and look at some of the recent cases of political persecution in Russia. In terms of the scale of these repressions, Vladimir Putin is second to only one Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. We asked the authors of the study, journalists from Proekt, what the difference is between Putin's repressions and the Great Terror of Stalin's time. Here's what Yekaterina Reznikov from Proekt, one of the authors of the study, told us.
It's saddening to acknowledge the darkest period of Russian history marked by devastating repression, which still linger in the memories of its people. Against the backdrop of Stalin's era, it may seem that under Putin, Russia isn't as frightening. Sure, there are thousands imprisoned, but mass executions are not commonplace. It's somewhat pacifying. However, it's crucial to understand that the repressions under Stalin, Peter the Great, and Ivan the Terrible share a common thread. They all demonstrate the absolute power of the state, doing as it pleases. We've only scratched the surface, merely analyzing what's visible. The true extent of totalitarian dictatorship is concealed within many other phenomena. For example, currently there is a wave of nationalization sweeping the country, when people are stripped of their property under various pretexts. For instance, businesses could be accused of supporting Ukraine. Meanwhile, Putin's affiliated oligarchs and state-owned companies continue trading with Europe and the United States, countries Putin labels as enemies. This double standard isn't coincidental, it's systematic. Background doesn't matter for Russian repression. Neither does the political system, monarchy, communism, or democratic facade, nor does the economic structure. Only one thing matters: who holds power. As my editor once said, in Russia, the only form of ownership is power. In this regard, the repressions under Putin and Stalin are no different. The number of victims is just a matter of time.
A recent victim of Russia's repressive term is Alsu Kurmasheva, a Prague-based Russian-American journalist with Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty's Tatar-Bashkir service. Kurmasheva was arrested in the Russian city of Kazan last October and charged with failing to register as a foreign agent. She was also later charged with spreading false information about the Russian army. We spoke to Alsu's husband, journalist and director of the real-time Telegram channel Pavel Butorin, about Alsu's case. What do you think was the real reason why Alsu was arrested?
Well, Alsu is held in detention solely because she is an American national and because at the time of her detention she worked at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. She's not an activist, not a politician. She is a journalist who traveled to Russia back in May in her free time for a humanitarian reason to help out her elderly mother, but she was detained at that time briefly, then she was released, and then again in October, she was detained on charges of not self-reporting as a foreign agent. And she became the first individual in Russia to be incarcerated on this absurd charge. And of course, this individual had to be an American citizen, which of course leads me to believe that the primary reason for her detention is her American citizenship and her work for a congressionally funded, editorially independent news organization.
Do you think that Russians who are also dual nationals with American citizenship are major targets for the Russian authorities today?
Well, if you're an American and you are in Russia now, you have a big target on you. So my advice is get out. Dual or not dual, if you're an American citizen and if you are in Russia, you are a target. I don't think I'm revealing any secrets here when I say that Russia has been purposefully collecting American hostages. We have Alsu, currently held in Russia, Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, Mark Fogel, and now Ksenia Karelina. Some of them are held in detention in Russia for exercising their First Amendment rights to free speech and association outside of Russia's borders, which is, of course, outrageous. And, these people include Alsu, who is now being investigated literally for a book that she didn't even write, but only edited.
Has her arrest had a chilling effect on the Tatar-Bashkir service Ideal Reality where she worked? And by that, I mean, have there been any consequences, like any topics that Ideal Reality are no longer to cover after her arrest?
I understand the question is about her website and her language service that she worked for at Radio Free Europe. I can't speak for them. I should let her colleagues and managers talk about her work for Ideal Reality or Azatek. It has some effect, obviously, on journalists, on independent journalists who cover Russian politics, and not just Russian politics, because Alsu is really a culture reporter. We at RFERL, we advise our people not to travel to Russia. Of course, at the time, back in May, Alsu understood all the risks associated with any such trip. However, at the time, she prioritized being a devoted daughter to her mother, and she made the decision to travel to Russia to help her out. Little did we know that she would be arrested. This was the last thing we were concerned about. And as a matter of fact, she spent 2 weeks in Russia without any incident. And it was on her way out that she was arrested. But yeah, our current advice for our journalists is not to travel to Russia. However, back to your question about whether or not it has affected our coverage of Russia, Again, I can't speak for her service, but I will speak for Current Time, and I am the director of Current Time TV. While it's very unfortunate, none of this has affected our coverage of affairs and news inside Russia.
And Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has been named as an undesirable organization in Russia. How could that labeling affect the outcome of Alsu's case?
We are still assessing how this new designation affects her ability to communicate with her colleagues and friends. Alsu hasn't done any work for RFERL since May 2023, and she's most certainly not working for RFERL while in a prison cell in Kazan. Alsu traveled to Russia in her private capacity. She wasn't doing any work. Again, she was there to help out her ailing mother. So there's very little association that remains between her and RFERL, which is now designated a so-called undesirable organization in Russia. And, Alsu is a political prisoner, and that's a fact that even the Russians won't deny, because she was arrested in October on a political charge of failure to register as a so-called foreign agent. And Russian law defines a foreign agent as someone involved in political activity. But I'll say it again, Alsu is not an activist. She's not an opposition politician. She's not in jail because she was caught dealing drugs or, shoplifting, or because she published an anti-government post in social media. She has done none of that. Alsu is in prison solely because she is an American.
How does Alsu seem to be doing? And what impact has her arrest had on her family?
Well, to say that it's been a very difficult time for our family would be an understatement. It's not easy to cope. We have two wonderful daughters. They're in their teenage years. I'm grateful that they're growing up in a free society. They are Americans who live in Europe. For a child who is growing up to be a free person, it is hard to comprehend that their mother is now held behind bars by a hostile government for something that she helped publish and edited. We hope for the best. However, we do understand, and my children understand, the kind of regime that we're dealing with here. So it's been hard. The kids have been without their mother for more than 8 months now, of which more than 4 months Alsu has been behind bars. Our communication with Alsu is very limited. She has been denied phone calls with her family. We haven't heard her voice for more than 4 months now. As an American citizen, she has been denied visits from representatives of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. So yes, it's been hard, but we are blessed to have very supportive friends. The kids go to a very supportive school, and they enjoy their friendship and their hobbies and their school. So we have a lot of people to be grateful to, and we're grateful for the amount of support that we received from the European Union, from EU institutions, from the United States.
Is anything else being done to secure Alsu's release, as well as that of other US citizens, beyond calling on the United States to include them in a prison swap?
It's interesting you should mention a prisoner swap. As Alsu's husband, I'm not aware of any swap offers that may include Alsu. There may be things happening. I'm not privy to any sort of secret conversations. I have as much or as little information as you, occasional reports in the media, etc. But what we would like to happen is for the United States government, for the Biden administration, is to issue a determination of Alsu's detention as wrongful. Now, why it is important is because we want this determination to happen so that her case is elevated to a different level. So it is dealt with the Presidential Office for Hostage Affairs. Every day Alsu remains in prison is an outrage. The United States can't just stand idly by and allow journalists, American journalists, to be used as political pawns by the Russian government. Again, I'm not aware of any swap deals or offers. But again, the United States, the U.S. State Department doesn't discuss these things publicly for understandable reasons, so I can't really speculate about that. But what I will say is that the Biden administration can and must do more for the release of Alsu and all other Americans detained in Russia. We call on the United States government, on the State Department, to designate Alsu as wrongfully detained, as it has many other Americans held in Russia. This designation will raise the profile of the case against Alsu, and it will effectively commit the United States government to securing her release. The State Department has several criteria under which it determines wrongfully detained designations, and Alsu meets all of them. We believe she's innocent. She's held because she's an American citizen. Her arrest is literally an attack on press freedom. Her arrest even violates, as far as I'm concerned, the Russian Constitution, which prohibits censorship specifically. And we understand that while we hope for the best, but we understand that the Russian justice system is corrupt and is literally incapable of fair verdicts, as so many cases have proven lately.
Following the news that Navalny was allegedly killed before he was said to be exchanged along with 2 other US citizens, is there now less hope for Alsu to be freed?
I will always have hope. I can't say that there's less hope. Myself, my daughters, we all have hope. It is true that in the wake of the news of Navalny's death in prison, the lack of progress in securing the release of Alsu and other Americans held hostage in Russia is particularly troubling. No jail in Russia's penitentiary system is safe for its inmates, especially for political prisoners. I keep saying that apologists of the Kremlin, of Putin's regime in the United States and the West, they need to understand that the imprisonment of an American journalist in a faraway land for exercising free speech is an assault on their own fundamental freedoms too. So, yeah, imagine this, you're behind bars, you sit in that cold prison cell and you get the news of Navalny's demise. What is your reaction? You know, Alsu is prisoner by the same penitentiary system that is notorious for its mistreatment of political prisoners. I know that I do speak somewhat critically of the U.S. State Department. The real bad guys here are the prosecutors and the judges that issue these draconian sentences and verdicts. There was a recent appeals hearing in which a judge at Tatarstan Supreme Court denied an appeal filed by Alsu's lawyers to release her under house arrest due to her health. Again, Alsu is charged with a non-violent crime. She was charged with failure to register as a foreign agent, and there is this new criminal case launched against her about the book, which is really a collection of other people's opinions, which she didn't even write. And it's a non-violent crime. I really think there's no reason for her to be held in detention. She's not a flight risk. They seized all of her passports, her phones, etc. And this will too pass. Alsu will come back to us, to her family. But the judges and the prosecutors in her case, they will at some point tell their children, their grandchildren, oh, you know, such were the times. We were just following orders. It's still not too late for them to correct this injustice. They should release Alsu. I know we've spoken about a swap. Well, a really just resolution to this problem would be for Russia to drop its charges, its spurious charges against Alsu, and release her from detention, allow her to leave Russia, and return to her loving family.
To analyze Proekt's data about today's Russia, we spoke to Sergei Davidis, a member of the Memorial Human Rights Society, which researches political repression in the USSR and modern Russia. This week, Memorial's Oleg Orlov received a prison sentence for discrediting the military after prosecutors asked that the fine that was issued to him last year would be upgraded to a real term in prison. What's the greater significance of this trial?
For us, for Memorial and for Russian human rights community, for sure, it's a huge blow because Oleg Orlov was a founder of Memorial Society and he's key figure of human rights movement in Russia, person devoted to human rights and sacrificing for his values. For sure, we will miss him in our activity. But generally speaking, it's also a sufficient important event for Russian society as a whole, because anyway, he used to be a member of Presidential Council of Human Rights years ago, and he left this council protesting against Putin's words. But anyway, it was relatively unusual that so respected person could be deprived of his liberty. It shows, I would say, a new level of suppression of dissent in Russia, and there is something similar with Kagarlitsky's case. As in Kagarlitsky's case, in spite of all the differences, we see that after relatively mild first sentence, both Kagarlitsky and Oleg Orlov refused to leave Russia. They were given clear signal that they are not tolerated inside the country, but they failed to listen to this signal, failed to hear it, and after that the sentence was changed to a real prison term. It means that the threshold of tolerance to dissenting voices is getting lower and became sufficiently low than it used to be even a few months ago. I would say that these are main features of its significance.
Proekt's report says that Putin's Russia has surpassed both the Khrushchev and Brezhnev eras in terms of the number of extremism charges which political cases tend to fall under. Do you agree with the contents of this report? And if so, can these eras be compared in terms of the severity of the punishments issued?
Speaking about the project's calculations, we should understand that these calculations are relatively rough because not all the articles of criminal code used for political repression were considered by project, and some articles are used not only for unlawful politically motivated prosecution, but generally speaking, the result of the evaluations seems to be quite reasonable. So yes, I agree that after 2022, after full-scale war was unleashed by Putin's regime, the level of repression became sufficiently higher than it used to be in previous years and completely comparable and probably even higher than the level we had in Soviet Union under Khrushchev and Brezhnev. So yes, I think we can somehow rely on the conclusions, and for sure there is some difference. Actually, Soviet regime was much more honest. It had clear ideology, and it was clearly declared what is forbidden and what is allowed. It didn't try to show itself as a democracy. But now construction is much sophisticated and complex because this regime anyway is trying to camouflage itself by some democratic decorations, I would say so. And they use a huge set of articles of criminal code, for example, to prosecute civic society and even sometimes absolutely random people, but politically motivated and unlawful prosecution of these people can be used for state propaganda to confirm the messages the state sends to the society. And general picture shows that we have probably even more severe punishment for those who is prosecuted by the state, because they often use charges with terrorism, state treason, and it happens now much more often than it was under Khrushchev and Brezhnev. And these accusations suppose much more severe punishment. We know that last year, in 2022, life term was introduced as a punishment for state treason, and we have a peak of these accusations after the beginning of full-scale war. Moreover, the number of cases of these accusations is higher than the number of these cases for 30 years before. So I would say that in many aspects, prosecution of dissenters and other cases of politically motivated and unlawful prosecution are more severe than they used to be then.
The study also says that the current scale of repression in Russia today is second only to during the Stalinist period. How close is Russia today to the level of the Great Terror, and how does the Russian prison system compare to its infamous Soviet predecessor?
If we speak about statistics, it's still far from this level. Then millions were prosecuted, were deprived of their liberty and even executed. Hundreds of thousands were executed then. Now the level is much lower, and if we take proportions of persecuted to the population, even in Belarus, the level is much higher than in current Russia. But it only means that this regime these days faces lower level of threats than, for example, Belarusian regime faces. And in theory, at least, I am sure that Putin's regime is ready to sufficiently increase the level of repression if they consider they needed to continue to control the society. So now level is lower, but it can sufficiently grow in case of necessity. Generally speaking, Russian penitentiary system continues the Soviet one, and many features, many properties of current penitentiary system continue what we had under the Soviet power. But anyway, 30 years of even imitation of democracy has given some results. There are some changes, and generally speaking, I would say, at least now, human rights of those who are imprisoned can be defended better than it was in Soviet era. But it also can be changed, and we see that in neighboring Belarus, which is usually a few steps ahead of Putin's regime on the path of human rights violations and dictatorship, the situation is much worse. So the prospects are rather bad, but now for sure it's slightly better than it was under the Soviet power.
Memorial, the organization you represent, was founded during Perestroika and was ordered to close down in late 2021. What does that signify for Russian society?
I would say that it signifies an attempt of the state to monopolize the history. The state can even condemn mass repression of Stalin's regime, but there is only one right position about it, and only the state can properly express position about the mistakes of the state. Generally speaking, Putin's regime prefers to say that the Russian state always was right and it hasn't made any sufficient mistakes, but even if they are ready to condemn some actions of previous regimes, it should be done in the manner they consider right. So they do not want to allow anybody, and especially to Memorial, to democratic organization devoted to human rights, to discuss historical issues, to offer picture of Russian history differing from the official one to the Russian society. It's an element of their ideological effort. They actually do not have real ideology, but they have a kind of simulation of ideology relying on so-called traditional values and cult of the state. And for sure, position of Memorial based on the respect to human rights to the people, not to the state, could not be tolerated.
You mentioned that the Soviet Union was more logical and methodical in the way it carried out its repressions, whereas Russia today is more unpredictable. Can virtually any Russian become a victim of political repression? Or is it still more accurate to say that certain individuals are more likely to be targeted than others?
I would say that there were differences in different periods of Soviet history, and when we speak about Stalin's era, for sure nobody could be safe. And when we speak about later periods, about Khrushchev's and Brezhnev's periods, then yes, the Soviet repressions could be much more predictable than earlier, and yes, you are right, than now. Because today not only those who really somehow fights, somehow resists the state and dictatorship, not only those who actually protests against the war can be prosecuted, but it often happens that people become random victims. I mentioned about it. They can be randomly chosen to be prosecuted just in order to confirm some thesis of state propaganda, like Russia is sieged fortress, Ukrainian is hostile state, and so on. There are many theses of this nature, and often they believe it's important to confirm this thesis by real criminal cases. And an absolutely clear example is prosecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. I believe that there is no real functional interest of the state in this prosecution. But this repressive machine, having no real feedback, having been launched, can hardly be stopped. And so it's also the reason why many people who could not foresee that they give any grounds for the prosecution can really be prosecuted. For sure, there are people who can be, I think, sure that earlier or later they will become an object of prosecution. And for example, my colleague Oleg Orlov, who got 2.5 years of prison yesterday, I think understood that if he publicly protests, if he publicly expresses anti-war stance, if he publicly condemns dictatorship, earlier or later he will be imprisoned. And he was ready for that. He's a heroic person. But there are a lot of people who just made a joke or even didn't do anything they expected can be tolerated by the state. But you are right, today nobody can be really sure of his safety.
That's all for this episode. Thank you for listening to Russia on the Record. Be sure to follow the Moscow Times on social media and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to make sure that you join us next week.